938 Live. This is Talkback.
Lots being said about university rankings, and we talked about that last week. Today, the question is, would a local undergraduate education for our PSC scholars make them less capable of serving Singapore in the public service, or more capable of serving Singapore in the public service? Is that local education, university education, essential for that? Now, in response to the latest World University Rankings by Quacquarelli-Symonds, or QS, last week, one Mr. Richmond Lee wrote into the Voices column of the Today newspaper, expressing the idea that we rethink undergrad studies abroad for public scholars. In his letter, Mr. Lee said that despite his skepticism about the different ranking standards, he's heartened that the National University of Singapore and the Nanyang Technological University continue to climb the ladder. And NUS retained its standing as the best university in Asia for a second year running. NTU is now just one of two universities less than 50 years old to be ranked among the world top 30. We did say that you need to take those university rankings with a pinch of salt and think about the criteria that you would personally want fulfilled when you pick a university of your choice. But fact remains that if these universities are coming up okay against other universities, why should our PSC scholars be sent abroad for studies before they serve Singapore? So Mr. Lee asks, since both NUS and TU have now attained first world university status officially based on these rankings specifically, whether an undergraduate education for our PSC scholars locally would make them any less capable of serving Singapore. He himself doesn't think so. What do you think? Is the premium we place on an overseas university education really warranted? Should our PSC undergraduate scholars actually, in fact, all study locally? And why should they really? 669-11938. Talk to us also on Facebook, official 938 Live.
Now, Mr. Lee's rationale is that we are not training our scholars to be academics. We're sending them for a good education at taxpayers' expense to benefit Singapore with their knowledge gleaned from world-class faculty in our local universities. Now, don't NUS and NTU qualify now as world-class? Mr. Lee begged the question. He feels that since PSC scholars commit to serve the public, all the more they should spend their time locally and understand Singapore from the ground up, especially as undergraduates. Mr. Lee believes that the experience of pursuing an education in our own universities would better tune the scholars' sensitivities to local and grassroots issues while giving them a global dimension. So now is the time, Mr. Lee feels, to re-examine the PSC's policy of sending our scholars overseas. Question is, do you feel that if our PSC undergrad scholars studied at local universities, this would give them a clearer understanding of the grassroots issues and the problems voiced by Singaporeans whom they have committed themselves to serve? Or do you think that our scholars may have too narrow an understanding and experience if they only study within the Singapore context? Is there something in studying and living overseas that builds up our students more? Is it also interacting with all the top young minds of the world overseas? Now, joining us on the line is Eugene Tan. He's Associate Professor of Law and Co-Director of the SMU Centre for Scholars Development. Good morning, Eugene.
Morning, Andre.
Hi, Eugene. Now, you have spoken before about having, say, more Singaporeans in the academic scene in Singapore, local academia, to be teaching at universities. And that's, I believe, kind of related to what's happening here. What do you think of Mr. Lee's idea that all PSC undergraduates study here in our local universities first?
Well, Barsi, I think there are PSC scholars who are given local merit scholarships to study in our local universities. But I appreciate Mr. Lee's point. I think his point is that given that our universities have attained good university rankings globally, there's no reason why more of them shouldn't be spending time in our local universities. And I think on that principle, I can actually agree with that. But there are also merits to sending, our top students, to universities overseas. And I think the question now here is really, trying to get the right balance.
Okay. Would you say it should be a requirement that PSC scholars have part of their tertiary education in Singapore? And why? What are the merits of that, first of all?
Right. Well, if I had my way, I would say yes. Certainly not, maybe not the entire duration of their course of study, but certainly, to have, to spend a term, in our local universities.
What are the merits of that?
Well, one of the merits is that it would enable, some of our future policymakers, top bureaucrats, to have a better understanding of Singapore society, to be in an environment where, they are really immersed, in many of the issues and challenges that Singaporeans face. I think that certainly gives them, a better grounding, and I think you would get them, up to speed very quickly.
I noticed that you did your undergraduate studies in Singapore as well, and then went overseas. Tell us about your experience. What value did it lend to your career, for instance, and your understanding of Singapore?
Right. Well, I think spending time in a local university, forces you to in many ways, to build up that local network of friends and contacts. It also gives you a very good opportunity, to be familiar with many of the different issues. But studying overseas also has its many merits, right? So one is, of course, you are in a company of top students from around the world. And I think that's something which our universities are working towards. We haven't quite gotten there, but it's something they're working towards. So it is an environment in which our top students can be challenged, both academically and intellectually. And of course, given that many of them would be making policies or implementing policies, it's also good for our top students, to be exposed, to the global realities, the global challenges, for them to be familiar, with key decision makers in future, so that makes it easier for them, to engage, with their foreign counterparts many years down the road, So, and of course, living overseas also is, an opportunity for our students, who live pretty much in a very much sheltered environment here, to expose themselves and to challenge themselves, in living abroad.
Eugene, do you think if all these PSC scholars just did undergraduate studies here, but then had the opportunity to do their postgraduate masters maybe overseas, then would that also open the window for them to be exposed externally as well? Or would that be too late? Would that be too late?
Well, I think it wouldn't be too late, and I think it certainly exposes them as well, But the challenge that the PSC face, as I see it, is that when 19-year-olds are looking for a scholarship, many of them are very much taken in, by the appeal and attraction of being able to study abroad, in a world-class university.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a pool which many students find it very hard to resist. And given that the PSC is also competing with, with scholarship bodies, both from the statutory boards as well as private organizations and companies, the PSC still has to be mindful of, has to be mindful that scholarships are attractive enough. And at the moment it is, I think I raised a parliamentary question, and apparently, 80% of PSC scholarship people who are offered PSC scholarships, take up the offers. I suspect that if the requirement is that they spend their undergraduate studies in Singapore, then I think the take-up rate would be much lower.
That sounds rather sad, but why? Why do you think that it is so seductive to go overseas and not go to a local university? I mean, shouldn't it be about a good education, and a good education can be had here as well?
Oh, definitely. I don't think that the students are concerned that, they will be shortchanging themselves, academically. But put yourself back, when you were 19, or when you had opportunity to further your studies, whether locally or overseas, And I think for many of us, the opportunity to be able to live, and study abroad, is actually something, very attractive. And given that, our students these days are very much well-traveled lot, I would say that, the ability, the opportunity to be able to study it, in a top-ranked university abroad, in a foreign country, the attractions that come with those, is something which is very appealing. And I suppose, one other point is that I think despite, NUS's and NTU's rise in several university rankings, I think the perception among our top students is that many of the universities overseas, even though they might be ranked lower than NUS and NTU, would actually offer a better proposition for them.
Why exactly?
So there is that branding part to it, which we still need to be mindful of. But I think things are changing. So the question now is how quickly that will change. But I would say that even if our universities become top rank in the world, if that day were to come, that it would still make sense for our policymakers, our bureaucrats, to actually have this exposure, through studying abroad.
I understand what you're saying, but you did say that we need a balance, and we'll talk about that balance when we continue. So if a balance is needed in terms of exposure to a local undergraduate degree program versus a foreign one, how can more be convinced to stay here? How can more be convinced of the merits of doing at least part of their tertiary education in Singapore? Stay with us on 938 Live. Should PSC scholars be offered places at local universities instead of foreign ones for their undergraduate education? Would it make a difference in terms of how they serve Singaporeans in the public service? We're talking today with Eugene Tan, Associate Professor of Law and Co-Director of the SMU Centre for Scholars Program. And we want to know how you feel about this. Would your kids opt for a foreign university education rather than one at the local universities, in spite of the fact that our universities are supposed to be world-class according to some global rankings? Why is it more seductive to go overseas for an education? Now, Eugene, you said a balance needs to be struck, but you did admit that there are some compelling reasons for a 19-year-old to choose a university education overseas rather than stay in Singapore. So how can the prospect of an education of undergraduate studies in Singapore be made more seductive?
Well, I think one is certainly, our universities have certainly have a global footprint. So that is not just through them being able to attract, foreign students to come to study in Singapore, as fully matriculated students and not as exchange students. Although we also do have that, but also the fact that we now do have faculty from around the world. So in many ways we have brought the world to Singapore, and our universities also are rapidly developing the range of exchange partners, programs in which students can go for a term or two, to study in a foreign university. So these are many ways in which our universities are trying to enable our students to have a global experience, if I can put it that way. But I suppose for many 19-year-olds or 21-year-olds, for those who have done national service, the attraction of living abroad, of being on your own and in a different socioeconomic environment, different type of weather, that these are still, intangibles which I think many young people find attractive.
Stay with us on 938 Live. What would you advise your child to do if they were faced with that choice to study locally or overseas when it comes to university education? We have world-class universities here too. So why is it that going overseas is still such a seductive thing? Also, some have said, in fact, Richmond Lee has said, he wrote into the Voices column of the Today newspaper, saying that we should rethink undergrad studies abroad for public scholars. They should do so locally. They should study locally so that they can be more in touch with Singaporeans' needs and serve Singaporeans' needs better in the public service. Lester Lam has brought up a very interesting point on Facebook, saying that perhaps we're missing the point. What we need to do is ensure that our local scholars are in touch with what's happening on the ground. Would a local university education do that? Stay with us on 938 Live. Thank Thanks for joining us on Talkback on 938 Live. Should all our scholars be required to do at least part of their tertiary studies in a local university? Will that really help them serve our people better once they enter the public service? Give us a call, 669-11938. We're joined today by Eugene Tan, who is a political observer from the Singapore Management University, and he was saying earlier that it just seems that people are more interested in going overseas if they could choose between studying in an overseas university and studying locally. And I think many of you would agree. Find out what your children would like. I know in my time, several of my classmates, when they had to choose, decided to go overseas because they wanted that international exposure. And really nothing wrong with that. But how important is local exposure? Is an education from primary school, from preschool to secondary school to junior college enough for that local exposure? And maybe at the university level, you can just go overseas and get the international exposure. What do you think? 669-11938 is our number. Some of you have been talking to us on Facebook as well. Lester Lam is one of them. He says the main issue here is that scholars are losing touch with the people on the ground, and that's not because of being educated overseas. The scholars really need to be given the chance to learn from the very bottom of an organization's hierarchy, understand the challenges and working culture of the people on the ground. Many times, scholars are perceived as people who work in the headquarters offices, detached from the ground, and worse, formulating policies that will affect the greater organization and the public, but without understanding what is really happening on the ground. Eugene, what do you think of Lester's comments there?
Yeah, I think Lester certainly raises a legitimate point.
But he says, I think he's also implying that while we talk about how the scholars need to be more in touch with what's happening on the ground, an education in the local university may not be the panacea for that.
Certainly, right. So I think in the end, it's really not so much about, whether our top students on scholarships, on government scholarships, are schooled abroad or locally. It's really about, how can we ensure, that they are familiar with the issues on the ground, that they recognize, what public service entails, and to be up to date. And I think in that regard, the PSC has been very conscious of this. And I say this because, I was invited to speak with, the PSC scholars in the UK and Europe back in 2011. So I was asked to give them an update on local political developments after the 2011 general elections. So and I understand that these Singapore seminars are regular events conducted by the PSC. So PSC is certainly aware, that of this public sentiment, and it could be that they may have observed that of returning scholars. And so many of the scholarship requires that the students to come back on attachments, to their respective ministries or statutory boards. So there is this effort, that is being made. And I think the message of ensuring that people know what they're getting themselves into is something that needs to be to be reinforced.
What about having them really start at the bottom of any organization that they're attached to? Lester seems to think that is key in order for them to know what really is happening on the ground and to serve Singaporeans better.
Well, I think in many ways, they don't get parachuted into the top positions. Many of them do start off, like any other graduate. It's just that, that their passage, is probably customized and perhaps fast track. But again, as far as I can see, the PSC is also aware of this. So you see many more government scholars, being attached to the community development councils, as part of this whole effort to get the scholarship holders, to be mindful, of the ground realities, and I think that's something which which again needs to be continually emphasized. So I don't think it's really whether you could spend 4 years in a local university, but spend all your time in a library, or totally be disconnected with what's happening around you. And I don't think that would make any difference at all.
Exactly. So doesn't that then again put into question the merits of staying local in terms of one's tertiary education, one's university education?
Yeah, so there's nothing magical in in staying in Singapore and then saying and assuming that automatically someone's going to be on top of things that's happening here and what's the public sentiment, what's the public mood like. I think in the end we need that combination of measures. Getting the scholars rooted to Singapore. Enabling them to have opportunities to be able to find out what's happening, and I suppose it all boils down to selection, right? How do we select scholarship holders who are genuinely interested in the welfare of the people,
serving the country,
in policy, and serving them, rather than this is a ticket for me, to go to a top university overseas.
How can the local universities actually add to this experience for scholars, in order to help them actually learn more about what's happening on the ground, really interact with the breadth of people who study at the university? Because I remember when I did my tertiary studies, it was quite an eye-opener, because you met people from all parts of the country and from various walks of life, something that might have been lacking from the time I was in secondary school, for instance.
Yeah. Well, I think that's, again, something that the local universities are very conscious of, So I think that there's a recognition that, our our students, those are privileged enough to have the opportunity to have a university education in Singapore, need to recognize their social responsibilities. And I think in the many scholarship programs that the different local universities have, and I can certainly say that for SMU, because I come from I lead a center which, seeks to ensure that students are mindful of their larger role and responsibility and duties. That much as they receive, all the more they should give and they should pay it forward. So I think the universities are conscious of this, and I think this is something that the PSC, could work, with the local universities, in trying to inculcate, a greater consciousness, of the special duties, if I could put it that way, that the scholarship holders have, and also, try to give, the local students, as many opportunities, to have a global experience. So this need not necessarily be through exchange programs in terms of spending one term abroad, but it could be going abroad for to study policymaking in other parts of the world.
You mentioned a global experience, and some time ago, something that came up really caused a lot of discussion in the online world as well as offline world, and that was the question of whether we have enough Singaporean members of faculty in our local university. So in fact, I think some people said that it was too global. A lot of our faculty members in universities are from overseas, and we're not attracting or keeping enough Singaporean faculty members. And I think you were a part of this whole debate as well. You brought this up as an issue to be concerned about. Why so exactly? I mean, would having more local faculty also help that process along to some extent, to ensure that the students who are there are a little more in touch with what's happening on the ground, and that the local faculty members also have to be of the sort who don't just stay in their ivory towers and don't really know what's happening on the ground, right? So there are various things to consider here, right?
Correct, definitely, right? So essentially, yes, if we can keep and maintain and develop a strong Singaporean core among the faculty in our local universities, then I think there's a higher chance that the Singapore issues would then feature more prominently in our local universities. Our students will have the opportunity of studying local issues, and contextualize against what's happening here and comparing it with what's happening in countries overseas. So there's this opportunity of comparing and contrasting and trying to find out what works and what doesn't work. So So again, there's no magic in a Singaporean faculty, but it is important nonetheless, to nurture a strong Singaporean core.
I wonder what you think if you're listening in right now. Several of you have been talking to us on Facebook, and I wonder what choices you would help your children make if you were in a position to influence them. If they had to choose between local and global, what would they choose and why? Felicia Huang says on our Facebook page, we must not miss the point that social gaps exist between the rich and poor here, the better educated and the not so educated. Being a Singaporean is about having one's conviction and the values that Singaporeans live by. In today's context, it's about building relationship, the extra drive, the I care attitude. I think talking again, Felicia, about what really matters when it comes to public servants. And if we're talking about public service scholars, what types of qualities they should be imbued with. Today, really talking about whether there's a connection between them understanding Singapore issues and understanding the needs of Singaporeans and being able to serve them, and the universities that they went to. Would going to a local university, well-known universities that we have in Singapore, well-ranked globally, actually help them make that connection? Now, Eugene, you did say earlier that our universities perhaps have to keep up with the global race for knowledge and talent in terms of faculty members as well as in terms of students and local students as well. What do you think our universities would need to do in order to do this better so that not everyone succumbs to the siren song of the global education overseas rather than a global education locally?
Well, I think one is, as I mentioned earlier, is the attempt to bring the world to Singapore. But I think in our local context, I think that, there is a need for the local universities, to encourage, and to provide a nurturing environment for both faculty and students alike, to be able to develop their interest in local issues. And I mean, Singapore is unique in many different ways when you look at in terms of our socio-political development or even our economic development. And unfortunately, the incentives in publishing, in top journals, tend to be weighted against consideration of Singapore issues. Never mind if the studies are very theoretically interesting, because we are seen as very often as an outlier. So I think it is important in that regard to ensure that even as we globalize our footprint, our quest for knowledge and talent, that we are firmly rooted and grounded, in the Singapore context. After all, our universities are Singaporean institutions.
Thank you very much for that, Eugene. Eugene Tan, Associate Professor of Law and Co-Director of the SMU Centre for Scholars Development. SMU, of course, is the Singapore Management University. Thanks for joining us on Talkback. And many thanks for all your comments on Facebook, Official 938 Live. You can continue talking to us there.